The camera opens on a quiet apartment at night. Lights from other buildings flicker through the window. Somebody else owns all of them. Here's the uncomfortable truth we don't like to say out loud. For millions of people, rent is no longer a temporary phase. It's a permanent condition. You work, you earn, you pay. And at the end of every month, your money disappears into an asset you will never own. Not because you failed. Not because you were irresponsible. But because the system quietly rewired itself while you are busy surviving. This is the story of why rent is starting to feel less like housing and more like a modern form of economic bondage. And why this matters right now. Because rent didn't always work this way. Go back a few generations. Rent was transitional. Something you did on the way to ownership. A short chapter, not the whole book. You rented when you were young. You saved. You bought. That was the deal. But somewhere along the way, that deal changed. Today in many major cities, rent isn't a bridge. It's a treadmill. You can walk faster. You can work harder. But the ground never actually moves. And to understand why, we need to strip away the moral stories we tell ourselves and look at the math. Because the math doesn't care about effort, or discipline, or motivation. The math only cares about ownership. At its core, rent is simple. Someone owns an asset. You pay them to access it. That's not new. What's new is who owns the asset and how aggressively they're optimized. In the past, landlords were often individuals, a retired couple, a family with one extra property, a small, inefficient system. Today, housing is financial infrastructure, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, global capital funds. They don't see homes. They see yield. And yield needs consistency. A renter who stays forever is more valuable than a homeowner who leaves the system. That's the first uncomfortable shift. The system no longer wants you to graduate out of renting. It wants you locked in. Here's how that lock-in works. First, prices rise faster than wages. Not a little faster. Structurally faster. In many countries, rents have doubled or tripled over the past 20 years. Wages haven't. So every year, rent takes a larger share of income. 30% used to be considered the danger line. Now 40% is normal. 50% is common. In some cities, it's higher. At that point, saving isn't hard. It's mathematically impossible. You're not bad with money. Your cash flow constrained by design. Second, rising rents push up property values. Higher rents justify higher prices. Higher prices require larger down payments. Larger down payments delay ownership, which means more renters, which means more rent pressure. It's a feedback loop. The system feeds itself. Third, debt fills the gap. Credit cards, personal loans. Buy, dash now, dash pay, dash later. Rent doesn't just drain money. It forces borrowing to cover everything else. That debt keeps you working, keeps you compliant, keeps you you can't quit. You can't move easily. You can't experiment. Your freedom shrinks quietly. And that's where the slavery analogy starts to make people uncomfortable. Not because it's morally identical, but because economically, the mechanics rhyme. In traditional slavery, Labor was owned directly in modern rent-driven systems. Outcomes are owned indirectly. You don't own your shelter. You don't control your costs. You don't build equity. But you're fully responsible for producing income to maintain access to basic survival. Miss a payment, and you're not just late. You're homeless. That's not a metaphor. That's leverage. Now here's where the irony kicks in. We're told renting gives flexibility, freedom, mobility, and on paper, that sounds right. But look at reality. When rent consumes half your income, moving becomes expensive. Security deposits, broker fees, higher prices everywhere else. Flexibility becomes theoretical. Ownership, ironically, becomes the more stable position. But ownership is increasingly gated. Not by effort, by capital. And capital is concentrating. In some markets, institutional investors buy entire neighborhoods. They outbid individuals because they don't need emotions to justify prices. They're playing a different game. They borrow cheaper. They scale faster. They absorb losses longer. And when they own enough supply, they set the rules. Not with conspiracy, with spreadsheets. Here's the uncomfortable math they love. If rent rises 3% per year, that sounds reasonable, normal, manageable. But over 30 years, that's more than double. Now compare that to a fixed mortgage. Your payment stays the same. Inflation erodes it. Your income eventually catches up. One path compounds against you. The other compounds for you. Rent isn't. It extracts value every month without ever flipping direction. That's why long-term renters often feel like they're running in place, while owners appear to get richer by accident. It's not luck. It's math. And here's where the story gets darker. Governments know this. They talk about housing affordability. They announce subsidies. They tweak interest rates. But structurally, they're trapped. Rising property values make voters feel wealthy. They support banks. They stabilize balance sheets. So policies quietly protect asset owners, even while pretending to help renters. Public messaging says, just save more. Underlying reality says, you'll never catch up. And then comes the cultural gap. We're told renting is a lifestyle choice. That ownership is overrated. That experiences matter more than assets. That sounds progressive. Until you ask who benefits. Because someone still owns the buildings. They're just not you. When ownership concentrates, power concentrates. Owners decide pricing, terms, renovations, evictions. Renters adapt. An adaptation becomes a full-time mental load. Every year, you wait for the notice, the increase, the reminder that this isn't really your home. That constant instability has a cost. Stress, delayed families, delayed careers, delayed risk-taking. An economy built on permanent renters becomes conservative in the worst way. People can't afford to fail. Now, zoom out further. This isn't just about housing. It's about how modern capitalism treats necessities. When something becomes unavoidable, it becomes extractable. Housing, healthcare, education. You don't negotiate from strength when you can't walk away. Rent is powerful because shelter is not. That's why investors love it. It's predictable, inelastic, emotionally anchored. People will skip vacations before they skip rent. They'll skip savings. They'll skip health care. That makes rent one of the safest cash flows in the world. And safety attracts capital, which pushes prices higher, which pushes ownership further out of reach. The loot at tease point, some people say. This is just how cities work. But that's historically false. Cities used to be ladders. Now they're moats. They attract ambition and monetize it. You move in young. You pay rent during your highest energy years. You leave later with little to show for it. The value you created stays behind, captured by ownership structures you never entered. And here's the quiet twist. The system doesn't need everyone to be trapped. Just enough. As long as there's a steady base of permanent renters, prices hold. Returns stay attractive. Capital keeps flowing. Mobility becomes a luxury good. Ownership becomes inherited, not earned. And that's the real risk, not high rent, but a society where shelter is increasingly divorced from work and tied instead to prior capital, where effort doesn't buy stability. It only rents it. So where does this end? Not with collapse. Systems like this don't implode dramatically. They calcify. You get cities full of renters, suburbs full of debt, and a small ownership class collecting quiet, compounding flow. You get less innovation, less family formation, less upward mobility, all while GDP looks fine. And the final irony, the system frames this as freedom. No chains, no owners of people, just contracts, terms, renewals. But when access to basic life depends on perpetual payment, an exit is structurally blocked. At what point does choice become illusion? That's the unresolved question. Not whether rent is literally slavery, but whether a society built on permanent renting can still honestly call itself free.